Hello and welcome to the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
And I'm Philip.
In case you didn't know. Dave will be joining us a little bit later as well. And I do apologise to everyone for not streaming for the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm actually still standing at the moment because of my back injury. I actually did probably my first little workout, no weights or anything like that today, just an insanity, and I'm definitely feeling a bit sore again, but I haven't spasmed, so I figured I'm good to continue tonight, and I've been really looking forward to tonight's stream because Philip has prepared a presentation for us, haven't you, Phil?
Yes, I have, and I hope nothing breaks. I genuinely hope that there's going to be no issues. But let's hope everything runs smoothly.
If you want there to be no issues, you're on the wrong stream, man. You know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I should have known that before getting on here. Yes,
it's gonna cut out halfway. Oh look, speak of the devil, and he appears.
Yes.
Yes,
Hi,
Dave. Hello, Dave.
There we go. Hello.
Yes.
How you
Sorry
doing?
about that.
That's all right,
not
Dave.
Too bad.
These things happen. We can't always be everywhere all the time when we need to be. It's only a couple of minutes anyway. I had a little boogie instead.
Nice one. Yeah, no, we tried out the new rice cooker and it took longer to cook than we thought it would. It took 30 minutes and we thought it would be like 15.
Oh wow, that is a lot longer. Was the rice good though?
Oh, it was so good. It was
really
perfect.
That's good to hear.
I must admit, I'm absolutely terrible at cooking rice. I mean, I've been a chef. I know how to cook a lot of things great. I've made some of the best curries I've ever had. But when it comes to rice, at best, it's a little bit shit.
That's why we've been using microwavable packets. But
so do we.
It was like £2 for a small pack of rice that has about 6 portions. And it's £1 for one portion of microwave rice. So it's going to...
Oh no! There you go, Philip. There's the first error happening. Dave's not here anymore.
Yeah, but he is now. He is back.
But I think he's gone again. Oh dear.
Yep.
So there's problems in Wales with the internet. Is there?
It would seem.
Yeah. Well, there you go. At least you know that's tonight's issue out the way, and it's all Dave and not you.
True.
So you're safe now.
Pressure on my presentation. Yeah, I'm safe now. That's another way of looking at it, I guess.
I love how he's just frozen exactly the same face. I wonder if he's actually been talking this entire time. Oh, I can hear him again. But he's still frozen in place.
Yeah, I mean, he moved a little bit, though.
He did.
Yeah, but yeah.
So, I mean, Philip, whilst we wait for Dave to oh, he's back. How you doing? No, he's gone again.
Yeah.
I think, Dave, you might have to do a little restart, although you probably can't even hear what I'm saying. So,
yeah.
So, Philip, why don't you tell us a little bit about what your presentation is going to be tonight whilst Dave sorts out his connection issue?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about logic first. So like the basics of logic and sort of like in a classical logic framework. So we're going to look at, stuff like the basics, propositions, and a lot of interesting stuff. We're going to look maybe a bit more in depth than we usually look at them on stream. We usually talk about them sort of more abstractly, but like today we're going to go a bit more nitty gritty on all these sort of little things. And then we're going to talk about paraconsistency and paraconsistent logics, which are sort of different kind of logic, works a bit differently. And finally, at the end, we're going to talk about like a very, very controversial thing in philosophy, which is called Dialetheism. And we'll see later on what
so
that
that's
is
how
and what
you
it means.
pronounce it. I've only ever seen it read. Written, sorry. I've only ever seen
I
it
have
written.
no idea if that's the way to pronounce it, by the way. I've just sort of made it up. And I hope it's the right way to pronounce it.
I have to do that with so much stuff I read. I mean, being dyslexic as well, it adds to it. The number of times I get words that I read and I just read them completely wrong. So, you could say it was anything and I'll just take your word for it. Hey, Luke, nice to have you here. Yes, he's just brought up today's conversation on today and yesterday's conversation on Twitter. Apparently, Answers in Reason is now a cult because
yes, it's true.
we promote basic epistemology, reason, and supporting your claims, and that makes you a cult.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, that's well known, I would say. Cultish behavior, critical thinking, and logic, and all of that. Typical.
I thought you said cunt, and I thought that describes me perfectly.
There's a reason I use DJ Wizard Sleeve when I do music. You've actually gone a little bit quiet today, Dave. I'm going to have to turn you up.
Yeah, I tried to too, but for some reason it doesn't work. At least for me, in Discord, it doesn't seem.
Yeah, you're a lot quieter than usual, Dave.
Yeah, all my sound seems to be kind of quiet.
Huh.
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible to hear you, though, right? I can still hear you fairly well. It's just that, yeah.
And to be honest, I mean, with what I've got on the other end, there should be enough boosting your gain a little bit. So people out there should be able to hear you, Dave, even if it's a little bit quiet for us. There's no music going on in the background, so we can still hear you, darling. Luke says, seems to me that when you've made it, when you have enough people following you, that people can say you're a cult. Yeah, apparently, yeah, that's all it is. Basically, you have enough people following you, and if they agree with you, then you're just all part of a cult. That's the logic.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Dave, have you had a look at your sound?
Is that any better?
Oh wow! Yes, I can turn you back down.
Turn you back. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
This is great now.
Yeah, perfect.
For some reason, it dropped all my volumes down.
That's all right. That happens from time to time, especially when you're using so many different bits of software. I find sometimes, Discord decides to change all of my microphones and headphones and everything like that to other bits. Sometimes the sound comes out of my monitor, and it's like, when do I ever use my monitor as a speaker? Admittedly, it has the ability to do it, but no.
Yeah.
Gremlins. Yeah, nice one, Nick. So, are you ready to get on with it?
Yes, I am. I hopefully am, yes. And should I share my screen?
Yeah, I'll quickly put it into Be Right Back, and
Okay.
then you share your screen. So... And we're back in the room. That wasn't too long. Hey, Leon, nice to have you here with us. Looks like there's a few more people connecting as well. You've all sort of joined at the right time. You've managed to skip the teething issues at the beginning of the stream that we always seem to have.
It wouldn't be a stream with me without any kind of drop-offs and disconnects.
But here we are.
But I'm super glad to have you for the stream, Dave.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
I value that a lot.
I wouldn't miss it. There's a lot I can learn here. So nice one, thank you.
This is I don't know. We'll see. Hopefully, it goes well.
It definitely will. I have faith in you, even though I'm an atheist.
Yeah, I know how this sort of stuff goes. Yes.
Oh, and Alice has just jumped in as well.
Who?
Alistair's just jumped in. So how you doing, Alistair?
Hey, Alistair. Nice to have you here.
So I know I like to give people a shout out when they come on, but once Philip does start, I'm not going to be giving out the shout outs. I'll just be messaging in the room. So because I think we need to focus on what he's doing. So anyone else,
you can stop me at any time. I find it kind of easier to address the things immediately if something comes up. If I know the answer, because it's not like I know everything here. But yeah.
Yeah, on that subject, any questions, put them in. If you can send them like straight to me, I'll try and keep my eye on the chat, and as they come up, I will ask Philip for you. Hey, Ravenclaw, nice to have you here as well. So I think we should just really let you get on with it, Phil.
Okay. So I think like it's useful for me to start by like explaining why I find this topic like interesting and all of that, because like generally speaking, I find it interesting and I find it helpful to figure out where things start to like where a system starts to break or where a system starts to have sort of trouble, because that usually can teach you a lot about, you know, what the system does well, what it doesn't well, and genuinely how it works. You sort of gain a lot of understanding when you understand where things can go wrong in certain places. And so that is why I'm sort of doing this, and it's also because I'm generally just, you know, passionate about logic and this sort of stuff. And so I stumbled upon this and I found it really interesting, and so I want to share a bit more with everyone else. Okay, so I think the first section is going to be dedicated to sort of like just going over the basics of logic and a bit visualizing how things work in sort of a classical logic framework, and then we'll figure out other things as we go on. So it is going to be helpful, I guess, to start with, you know, what logic is, and this is sort of a broad definition of logic, I guess. So it's the study of inferences and inferential relations. So it's basically studying how arguments work and how you can get from one set of things to other set of things and how they're connected with each other, and how you can preserve truth value when you go from one sentence to another sentence and so on. So the basic building blocks of logic are these tiny little things that we're going to call, and this is like a cube, but it's going to represent like a simple proposition for us tonight. So a proposition is a sentence that can be true or false. So for example, Joe is tired could be a proposition because it could be true or it could be false that Joe is tired. And so this cube is going to represent a proposition. Now, propositions in classical logic can have essentially two values. They can be either true or they can be false. And this is quite intuitive to understand what it means. It means that it doesn't correspond to reality if it's false. But it also depends sort of on what your view is on truth and all of that. That's a different topic altogether that we're not going to get into tonight. What it means for something to be true.
And I mean, even on that one, we did actually we did cover off the different definitions of truth in the Truth of It All. So if someone is more interested in truth, they can go back and check that one.
Yes, exactly. So we have these basic building blocks like these Legos, and so now we can do stuff with them, right? And so to do stuff with them, you usually have these things that are called operators in logic. And we're going to cover the main ones tonight, but there are, of course, many more. But these other ones are usually derived from the simpler ones. So the simpler ones should do the trick for pretty much most of it. So the simplest one, probably, the simplest operator is a negation. And a negation is basically inverting the truth value. As you can see, first of all, I put it inside of a cube as well. Both cubes are propositions. In fact, operators, whatever is the result of an operator is always going to be a proposition as well. So you're just building bigger propositions out of simpler propositions. But the negation essentially inverts the truth value of whatever it negates. So whatever is contained within the negation essentially is going to have a truth value, and the negation is going to be the opposite of that truth value. So, for example, if the small cube inside is represents Joe is tired, then the negation of Joe is tired is Joe is not tired. Now, if the small cube inside is true, so Joe is tired is true, then Joe is not tired is going to be false. Of course, we can invert that, right? If Joe is tired is false, then Joe is not tired is going to be true. A thing that I see often or sometimes confused when talking about negations in logic is this idea that, a negation means that it is false. But that is not necessarily the case, right? A negation just means the opposite of whatever, the thing that is inside of it is saying. So a negation could be true. For example, this negation, Joe is not tired, is true in this case, because Joe is tired is false, essentially.
Luke has just asked.
So all of these, yeah.
He says, so this is the case even if somebody doesn't believe it to be the case. So I may not believe that Joe is tired, but he will either be tired or not tired, regardless of my belief.
Yes, and that is an axiom of classical logic that we're going to look at later on. It's called the Law of Excluded Middle. So for any proposition, is either going to be true or is going to be false. It cannot be. There's no middle, essentially, between these. So that is one of the axioms. But yeah, the simple negation, basically, if you want to look at all of the possibilities of a given operator, usually you can visualize them in a table, and we call these truth tables. For a negation, it's a very simple truth table because we have just two possibilities, right? Either the thing inside is false or the thing inside is true. If the thing inside is false, then the negation is going to be true, and the opposite the other way around. So here we can see pretty much a bird's eye view of all the possibilities with a negation. Okay, so let's move on. Now, of course, in logic, you can have, one proposition if you want, but you can have, of course, more than one, and that's where the fun begins. So we have two propositions now. These are simple propositions, and we're going to distinguish them, we're going to name them. We're going to have a J and a D. So one is going to stand for now, Joe is tired, and the other one is going to stand for Dave is tired. Now,
both are true.
I should mention that sorry?
Both are true.
Always.
Okay. This symbolization here works well then, because they are sort of true, apparently. Anyway, I kept the J and the D just to distinguish these things, these propositions, even further along the way, where it might not make sense to think about them as Joe is tired and Dave is tired. At some point, they're just going to be sort of marked this way to be able to distinguish them.
In some respects,
they work well even as examples.
So in some respects, if you think about it a bit like algebra, like the value J is whatever the proposition is, and the value D is whatever that proposition is.
Yeah, exactly.
It's your distinguisher between two propositions. Yeah. In this case, it's very specific, but you could technically use any letter you wanted to represent your proposition.
Yeah. These are just, essentially, I just marked them to be able to distinguish them so they don't seem the same, and so you can identify where the J proposition is in a given setup and where the D proposition is, something like that. But for now, let's say that these represent Joe is tired and Dave is tired, right? And you can do stuff with operators where you have more than one proposition, right? So, for example, you can do a conjunction. And conjunctions are basically the equivalent of an and in regular language, right? So when you want to say something like Joe and Dave are tired, you're basically saying Joe is tired and Dave is tired, right? That would be the lengthy version of Joe and Dave are tired. This is the briefer version, but if you wanted to be pedantic about it, you like in logic, you should write the full proposition and the full other proposition. As we can see, if Joe is tired is true and Dave is tired is true, then the conjunction, so the entire proposition, the outer rim, is going to be true as well. But of course, it might not be the case that both of you are tired. So if Joe is not tired and Dave is tired, then the entire thing is false in this case. This is because a conjunction is only true when both of the elements it contains, both the elements that it conjoins, are true. So in order for a conjunction to be true, everything within it, everything that is sort of concatenated with it, needs to be true. So of course the same thing goes the other way around. So if Dave is tired is false, then the whole thing is going to be false as well. And if they're both false, it's going to be false, right? So we can visualize this again, sort of from a bird's eye view in this truth table. And so we can see that a conjunction is only ever true. And this, by the way, is true for any proposition, right? Like as I said, J and D here at the moment stand for Joe is tired and Dave is tired, but they could be like literally any other two propositions that we want. So yes, another thing that might be useful to keep an eye on as we move throughout this presentation is simply like the outer border rim of every cube. So this little thing here, as well as the symbol of the operator, are going to be like of the color that corresponds like to the whole thing, right? So if I say that this whole proposition, this whole conjunction is true, that is the case if the outer rim is like orange, and if the outer rim is sort of reddish, then it's false. We can see as well that like in logic, we usually symbolize a conjunction with a dot, but it could be like a few other symbols as well, which I'm not going to cover tonight, but there are a few other symbols that you can use for a conjunction.
There's actually a good Wikipedia. There's a good Wikipedia search. If you just look at logical symbols, and they just list all of them there, and all of the different symbols that are for and all the different symbols that can be used for not, and everything like that. Really useful. I'm constantly referencing it myself. It's
very, very useful. Yes, because many people prefer different symbols for different things, and so sometimes you find a symbol and you're like, what the hell is this? But then you realize that you can actually read it really well if you just convert it to something that you already understand. So that is a very good reference. Yes. Okay, so of course we have other operators, two more in this case. We're going to have a or operator, which is a disjunction in logic. And you might be able to see that this is pretty much the opposite of what the conjunction is, right? So if a conjunction is like the only instance where a conjunction is true is when both the elements that it contains are true. With a disjunction, the only instance where it's false is when both elements are false. And in all other cases, it's true. So you can see, for example, another thing that I wanted to say about the disjunction, actually, because this gets confused many times, because we have the tendency to use or in regular language to mean like to imply some sort of exclusivity between elements that you're listing, right? So for example, if I say we could go on vacation to London or to Amsterdam, or something like that. What I usually mean when I'm talking is that you have to pick, right? It's either or. You have to tell me one or the other, right? You can't take both. That's something that is very often intended when we speak regularly. But in logic, the or operator, or the disjunction, is very open to that possibility of going to London and to Amsterdam at the same time, because it's essentially saying, the only thing I care about is that at least one of the elements that I have inside of me is true. Right? I don't care how many. If they're both true, it's fine. If one of them is true, it's fine, right? But like if one of them has to be true. That's basically what you're saying when you're saying or in logic. There is another operator in logic that we're not going to cover, but it's called an exclusive or, and that does essentially what the what you would say usually when you're saying you can either go to London or to Amsterdam, and you can sort of derive it if you concatenate multiple of these simple operators together. Okay, and lastly, we have another operator, which is the if-then operator, or a conditional proposition. And here it might be helpful to first do some homework, in the sense that I have to sort of explain a few things, the anatomy of a conditional proposition, right? Because we have true elements in as with the other operators in a conditional proposition, but unlike the other operators that we've seen so far, the order in which they are listed matters in this case, right? Like with conjunctions and disjunctions, so with ands and ors, it doesn't matter what order they are in, right? If I say Joe is tired and Dave is tired, it's the same, logically speaking, as if I say Dave is tired and Joe is tired. Right? It's going to be the same thing, and the same thing goes for or. But with conditional propositions, that is not the case. With conditional propositions, it matters, the order matters. And so the first element is called the antecedent. Antecedent, I guess, is probably the best way to pronounce it. And the thing behind it is called the consequent. Right? And that is a useful way to identify, which one is which. And that would, in regular language, that would correspond to something like, if it's raining, then it's wet on the ground. It's raining would be the antecedent, and it's wet on the ground would be the consequent. Right? So the if part is the antecedent, and the then part is the consequent. Okay. The best way I found to picture, because this sort of stuff, when you first look at the truth tables in general, especially for a conditional, you sometimes get really confused because there are a lot of things that kind of make little sense here. But we'll see how to think about them. Like the easiest way that I found to think about what if then means, when in logic terms, and even if you use it in regular language, is to think about it this way, right? Like if I say, if this, then that, I'm essentially saying that I can guarantee that if the first thing that I'm mentioning is true, then the second one will be true as well. And in all other cases, it doesn't really matter. And so you can see that this is reflected in the truth table here, because the only way that a conditional is false is in this upper corner here, when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. That's the only way that a conditional can be false. In all other cases, it's true. And that it is true also when, for example, both the antecedent and the consequent are false, which is sort of called vacuous truth, and it's a weird thing that is highly unintuitive at the beginning. In fact, another thing that is kind of unintuitive if you think about it, and this happens in general when you look at truth tables, is to sort of think the other way around, right? Because you start to see all these propositions that they are composed out of, and then you start, for example, to think, well, if I say something like, if the Earth is a sphere, then I live in Italy. Right? These two propositions don't seem to have any relationship with each other whatsoever. Right? They seem completely random. Yet technically, because they're both true, if you put them into this sort of box, it would be the upper left corner, right? The Earth is a sphere would be here, and I live in Italy would be here. Then technically it would be true, right? That conditional would be true, which is a weird thing because it doesn't seem like it should be true or to say stuff like that, because it doesn't make sense. And this is why I think I find it helpful to distinguish between, just looking at sort of truth tables and then, thinking about the use case in argumentation. Because when you're using these sorts of propositions in arguments, you are working from the outside in, usually, which means that when you have, let's say that you have a first premise that is like something, if God exists, then there are no non-resistant non-believers or something like that, which would be like the first premise of the hiddenness argument. like what you're saying in that case is directly conditional. And given the fact that you are offering this argument to someone else that is going to like evaluate this, right? What you have to convince him is not, since you don't know, or at least, the one that is going to evaluate the argument is not going to know the individual values of the things that are making up the proposition. He's going to have to evaluate the proposition like holistically in general, like the if-then statement, and not the individual pieces that make it up. And the only way to make arguments that are strong and that people are going to accept, is to use premises that actually make sense to people. And so it is better if you actually use sentences and if-then sentences that make sense and that are easy to accept, not because you know the individual values of the things that they're made out of, but because you agree with the structure, let's say, of what they are saying, or what the conditional is saying in this case. So because like if I say, if the earth is a sphere, then I live in Italy, right? Then that might be like, nobody's ever going to accept that proposition, right? Nobody's going to accept that premise if I put it in an argument, because it doesn't make sense, right? It literally doesn't make sense to say that. So nobody's going to accept that. And so I'm not going to make any headway with that. And the only way people are going to accept that is if they already know the truth values of the individual premises that make it up, essentially.
Yeah,
but that is not useful, because if you already know...
Sorry, I was just going to say, they sort of have to have an intuitive pull to them for people to just
exactly,
accept them bare face.
Yeah, by the way, I don't see you two on camera anymore because my whole screen is covered, so I don't...
I'm just
I can't get
then. How dare you ignore me?
So you'll have to stop me a bit, like, if you want to...
sorry, I hate to interrupt, and I'm also kind of captivated, so don't worry.
Would another way...
No, it's fine, I love...
Sorry, would another way that this probably would be more effective in this case, that someone would accept at face value, is if they were to say, if I live in Rome, then I live in Italy.
Of course. Yeah, that would be a good type of proposition to put in, because that is acceptable even if you don't know the individual values of I live in Rome and I live in Italy. You don't know which one of these is true, but you can still accept the conditional because it makes sense. It makes logical sense, right? So that is a very good way to put it, right? So of course, you can make these weird conditionals if you want, as I said before, like these sort of completely unrelated things. If you already know whether or not they are true or not, the pieces that you're putting together. But since that is not what you're doing usually in arguments, it is sort of a useless thing. Because if you already know the individual truth values of everything inside of a conditional proposition, let's say, then it doesn't really make sense to see where it is going to go and how the argument is going to sort of come to a conclusion, because you already know the things that you would have to conclude, and so it doesn't make sense. So, of course, even if these sort of weird things are technically true, right, they are pretty useless in argumentation. So it's the best way to think about it is that when you say a conditional, right, you're saying that if the first thing is true, then the second one will be as well. That's pretty much it. And this is reflected in the truth table, because the only way a conditional is false is if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, right? That is no-go for a conditional. It doesn't like that. All other things are fine, but that particular combination is not good. Okay, so this pretty much covers now the four operators that we have in classical logic, which are disjunctions, conditionals, conjunctions, and negations. Do we have any questions so far?
Not from me.
No, that's been great.
Yeah, I think they're all okay in the chat as well. Guys, honestly, if you do have anything you want me to ask Phil, I don't mind interrupting him. I'm a rude bastard. One thing I will say is, I mean, a lot of this side is, if anyone is done any programming, this is how it all sort of works with programming languages as well. So this side of logic will make a lot of sense to anyone who's done even like, you know, some of your basic programming.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And the things that are not so you don't find usually in programming is the next thing that we're going to look at, which is sort of like arguments per se. But like the way operators work is very familiar to anyone that is programming. You know, if, then, and ands, and ors, and all of that.
Actually, we've just had a question come in. Bearded Heretic has asked the question, what does the operator that's, you know, the upward hat, that's the inverse of the or? It's an and. It's another version of and, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's, yeah. Yes. Yeah, we have... Oops, that I didn't want to do. That was a mistake. Okay.
But yes, no, and he's just then asked, is it the replacement for the conjunction? Yes, it is the replacement for the conjunction.
Yes.
As you said, there's a Wikipedia page. If you look up, just search logical notation, it comes up with all of them in there, and you'll be able to see all the different ones that come under there. People have, as Phil said, different preferences for how they use their things. At the end of the day, they're all a shortcut, and if you have your reference table there, you can understand what it means.
Exactly. Yes. Okay, so the next thing that I want to cover, and it's like a short detour, I guess, but it's something that I wanted to cover for a while because it's often misunderstood, and I just really want to showcase, and we've talked about it many times on here, which is the concept of validity. But the concept of validity gets confused often by atheists and theists. You know, we've seen it countless times when people say, you know, that the kalam is not a valid argument, and all of that because they don't tend to not understand what valid means. So in order to illustrate exactly how strict validity is in logic, here is what it means, essentially. So here is an argument. Okay, this might not look like an argument, but it's a visualization of an argument. In particular, it's what is called in logic modus tollens. So it's a valid inference form. And you can see that in the column in the left, there's the first premise. In the column in the middle, it's the second premise. And in the right column, it's the conclusion. So what this sort of visualization does, it's basically a truth table, but expanded to an entire argument. And it shows every possible combination of the simple propositions that could be, right? So you're basically taking a snapshot and a bird's eye view of all possibilities when it comes to this particular argument form, which is something like, for example, the hiddenness argument, a simplified version of the hiddenness argument, is basically a modus tollens argument, which is like, you know, if there is a God, then there are no non-resistant non-believers, but there are no non-resistant non-believers, so God doesn't exist. And this is basically the form that it takes. So what we can see is when you're looking for validity, you're looking for a very particular thing, right? You're looking for rows in this case where both premises are true, because what it means for an argument to be valid is that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true as well, right? So in this case, the bottom row is the only one that meets that criteria, and you can see that both premises are true and the conclusion is true. Right, and as like a reminder, like you can see whether or not a thing is true or not by looking at the border color, right? So we have like the orange color means true and the red color means false. So you can see that all of the borders in the bottom row are orange, and orange, and the conclusion is orange as well. And so this is pretty much a valid argument. Now, if we take it from a different angle, we can see a different form of an argument, which is very similar, but this is a fallacious argument, which is known as denying the antecedent. It's again a fallacy, a formal fallacy in logic. And we'll see very soon why it's a fallacious type of argument. You can see it's pretty much the same as modus tollens, but in the second premise, it denies the antecedent instead of denying the consequent. So it shares one row with modus tollens, which is the bottom one. As you can see, we have true cubes with an orange border, meaning that they're both true, and the conclusion is also true. And you would think this is great, and in fact, it usually is. But then you can see that the row above that has true cubes as well that are orange, meaning that they are both true. Both premises are true here as well, but the conclusion is not true. And so this is why denying the antecedent is fallacious form, because you can have a combination where both premises are true, and yet the conclusion is false. And for an argument to be... Sorry?
I was just going to say, could we perhaps be a bit more descriptive? So if we were to talk about the top row, if we were to use an earlier example where the top row... if it's raining, then the floor is wet.
Yes.
It's not raining, therefore the floor is not wet, but that's not necessarily the case. The floor could still be wet even if it's not raining, which is why that doesn't work. It's why that's not necessarily a valid structure.
Yes, and if we look at the previous one, with the same example, if it's raining, then the floor is wet. The floor is not wet. Therefore, it's not raining. This is valid because, of course, both because of what you said and because of you can see it here in the table that the only way for this argument, the only way for this argument to be actually for the conclusion to be true. Sorry, I'm getting confused a bit. Right, there is only one row in which the premises are both true and the conclusion is also true. Right, there's no row in which the premises are both true and the conclusion is false, as with this, which has the third row with true premises that are true and yet the conclusion is false. And this is the rain example. Okay, so this basically just shows you, right, there are some fallacies, formal fallacies that are intuitive, that are easy to understand when you just make examples. But there are other fallacies where it's a bit harder to figure that out. But with all of them, it's like the reason why these are invalid or valid is because of this sort of consideration. When you look at this and when you display all of the possible combinations and these sort of patterns emerge, then you can determine whether or not something is valid or invalid. And this is why it's also not really a matter of opinion, right? It doesn't matter if the things are assumptions or not assumption. It doesn't really matter. If it has a structure, if the structure is one such that it is a valid structure, as we've seen, for example, with modus tollens, then it's going to be a valid argument, irrespective of what premises are put in there, in place of a J and D in this case.
Actually, that's quite useful, because I think about that fallacies, and obviously there are times when something that is considered fallacious isn't actually fallacious, but the way that it is structured in this sort of format. So if you think about an ad populum, let's just say, most people believe this is true. That doesn't necessarily make it true. Or most people don't believe it's true. That doesn't necessarily make it true or false either. And thinking about it in this sort of structure is actually quite helpful to really understand why they are considered fallacious on another level that I actually just hadn't thought about. Thank you.
Yes, like there are, to be fair, like there are fallacies that are considered sort of informal fallacies, are usually fallacies that are not really related to the structure of like the formal structure of an argument. So these would be something like, straw manning, for example, that cannot be really visualized usually in this format, or if it would be visualized in this format, it would be evident, right? But there are sort of structures that might seem reasonable if you don't look at the structure. But if you know these structures, and I mean there are only a couple of them, honestly, that you have to sort of memorize which forms are valid and which ones are not. But like if you want to really understand why some forms are considered invalid, this is how you'll have to look at it, right? You'll have to look at the entire thing and see the truth table for every possible combination of these things, and then you'll find that you in sort of invalid inferences, you'll have one row where both premises are true and yet the conclusion is false, and that is a red bell, and that is going to signal to you that this is an invalid inference. And this could be like, you could do this with any type of argument if you're unsure. Of course, with people who learn logic and work with logic, often they sort of memorize the common patterns, because it's sort of tedious to write a truth table every time for every sort of inference that you would kill yourself with their arguments. But it's useful to see at a small scale, at least why, like this is basically as low as it gets, right? This is if you understand this sort of truth table, then you'll understand fully why certain forms are considered fallacious or like formally invalid, and why certain forms are considered invalid.
Question from Luke.
Sorry. And
he says, how could both premises be true but the conclusion false? He needs an example to understand that one.
Yes, so let's take this sort of example with the third row, right? And let's take your example with the rain, right? So if it's raining, then the floor is wet, right? And you have to sort of shift your thinking here, because you're looking at it from inside in. So let's say that it is raining is false and it's wet is true, right? This is basically what the third row is saying, because J stands now for it is raining, and D is standing for the floor is wet, right? So it is not raining, and like if you look at them separately, right, we know two things now. We know that it is not raining and that the floor is wet, right? So we can see that the conditional is going to be true, because if it's raining, then the floor is wet, as we've seen from the truth table of a conditional, is still going to be true. It's still going to be considered a true conditional. Then we're going to negate that it is raining, right? So we're going to say, not it is raining. And since it is raining is false, because it's not raining, then it is not raining is going to be true, right? So now you have two premises that are both true. And now let's move to the conclusion of this form, which would be, therefore, the floor is not wet, right? Because D stands for the floor is wet, but the form of this particular argument is not D in this case, right? So the opposite of D. And we know that D, meaning the floor is wet, is true. So the floor is not wet is going to be false, right? But that, of course, leads to a situation where we have two premises that we determine to be true, and yet the conclusion, which is the floor is not wet, is a false conclusion because the floor is in fact wet. I don't know if this was helpful, but
he says thank you, so I guess it was. I understood it too. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sometimes hard to square like these two layers because it's easy to make examples sometimes on a very high level, and these are sort of examples that everyone can understand digest really quickly. But then if you get to the sort of more sort of technical side of things, it can happen that, for example, all the examples that I shared before with the conditionals, right? When you start to wonder, wait, how is that possible, right? If I have two propositions that are both true and I put them in a conditional proposition, then that proposition is going to be true. Like that doesn't make much sense to me. And like you would be excused if that doesn't make much sense to you, because in fact it is very hard to wrap your head around. But you have to sort of shift your thinking about, like especially these sort of truth tables, because these truth tables are pretty much just, looking at every possibility, right? There's no combination that is not included in this view. So this just says basically, let's look at everything and see what happens. And again, like it's fine for a structure to be in a situation where you have a premise that is true, a second premise that is not true, and then the conclusion is either true or false. It doesn't matter, right? Because a valid argument simply means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion will also be true. That is guaranteed. If that is not satisfied, then it's not a valid argument. And as you can see, the third row is exactly that problem, because we have two true premises, and yet the conclusion is false. And so that's not good, and so that's considered fallacious.
Nice one.
While with the before one, you can see that the bottom row is the only one that has true propositions, and it's the only one that satisfies that criteria, and the conclusion is also true, so it's not a problem, so this is considered a valid argument. Now, I'm not going to go through every possible argument, but these are just two examples that I thought to bring up here.
Nice. And if anyone does have further questions on that one, like leave a comment, and I'll send Phil your way to explain it in more detail.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Now let's move on to, we've looked at the operators in logic, in classical logic, and these are the sort of like the three axioms that accompany these operators, right? We have the law of non-contradiction, which basically says not P and not P. So it is like you can't conjoin contradictory propositions, essentially. Right? This is a highly intuitive axiom of classical logic that there can't be contradictions. There can't be true contradictions, essentially.
Essentially, something can't be true or false.
No,
true and false.
True and false.
Sorry,
yes.
I meant to say and false.
Yeah.
Yes.
It can't be both true that you're streaming right now and false that you're streaming right now.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Streaming right now, exactly. Yes. Then we have the law of excluded middle, which you mentioned briefly before, which basically says just, it's really like P or not P. So for any proposition that you can think of, right, it's always going to be the case that either it's going to be true or its negation is going to be true, essentially. And the negation is going to, So for any proposition, it's always like this, this junction is always going to be the case. So you can always write it down. And you can always know that, at least if you subscribe to the law of excluded middle, you can always know that one of these two is true. And finally, we have the law of identity. Now, the law of identity is not really used in propositional logic much. It's more about sort of elements in predicate logic. Now, predicate logic and propositional logic can both fit under classical logic. So it's not like we're talking about a different type of logic. It's just the way sort of you symbolize these things that changes. In propositional logic, you're taking the whole proposition and dealing with the whole proposition together. And in predicate logic, you're breaking it down a bit, and you can have proposition with sort of variables inside of them. and it's a whole thing. The law of identity basically says, for all x, x equals x. So it's highly intuitive here as well, right? So for every thing, everything, it's going to be equal to itself. But now let's, I guess if there are no questions, I would move on into more sort of interesting bits that we can talk about now.
Just before we do, Luke, we've been in the chat, and he has raised a point. Maybe giving an example for each one would be worth it, especially if anyone's listening in the podcast, they can't actually see the chat going by. So if you give us an example of each one as you do it.
Yes. Okay. This is quite simple. So for the law of non-contradiction, it's like as Dave said before, right? It's either the case, it can be true that it can be both true that you are streaming and that you're not streaming, right? It can be true at the same time. That's basically what the law of non-contradiction is saying. Or it can be true that I exist and don't exist at the same time. Or it can be true that, you can put whatever you want in there. Literally any proposition will do, and it just means that it can be that both that and its negation are true at the same time. When it comes to the law of excluded middle, it's very simple. You can think of like any proposition, like I have a plant on my desk, and it's always going to be the case that either I have a plant on my desk or I don't have a plant on my desk are going to be true. Right? One of these is always going to be true. And this is true for any pair of a proposition and its negation, right? So you can know, for example, for sure that either there is a God or there isn't a God, essentially. And for the law of identity, this is a bit more complex, but I guess like this is more specific to predicate logic. But like if I essentially have a variable and I say, for example, Luke asked a question, right? You can write that in predicate logic like more generally. But it's always going to be the case that Luke equals to itself, right? That variable is going to be treated as itself in the rest of the proof, essentially. Or at least that's the best way that I can think about it right now.
It's essentially saying the thing is itself and it's not anything else. You know? And this glass that I'm holding is a glass. My inhaler is an inhaler. It's just saying the thing is what it is. Essentially.
Yes, it's very hard to explain something this sort of almost trivially true thing, right? That it's just that the thing refers to itself and it's going to maintain that identity.
And some people do contest the law of identity as well, which I do find quite funny. But we really shouldn't get into that because we can go down a whole nother world if we go down to the contests the law of identity.
Yeah, we're gonna actually look at a few things here with like no spoilers, but we're gonna look at people that deny one of these three principles. And that's sort of towards the end. I don't want to spoil which one of these it's going to be. Okay, but let's talk about contradictions for a second. Perhaps I just spoiled it, but whatever. There is a thing in classical logic, and we're going to look at it now. So let's say that we start a proof in logic. Right, and of something very simple. We start with not P and P, which would be a contradiction, right? So not Joe is tired and Joe is tired, for example, because P is just it's just a placeholder for any proposition that you want, right? So not Joe is tired and Joe is tired, or Joe is not tired and Joe is tired, right? Which is a direct contradiction. Now, you might think, well, we just said that this is not possible, right? And law of non-contradiction is something that we just explained, and it says that there can't be such a thing, right? But for fun, let's say that this could be a thing. Right? Let's say that we allow for this contradiction to be true. Right? So not P and P is true in this little example. So we can continue, and this is going to be also an insight in how sort of proof works in proofs work in logic, right? So to sort of give an overview, I'll walk through every step. So we can then write P, right, right after that, and this is because of something called simplification. And simplification is simply a principle whereby if we have a conjunction, right, and it's a true conjunction, we can take one of those elements and write it standalone. Right? This is, by the way, another helpful thing to consider here when looking at this is that in logic, when we write the different steps in a proof, when we write each step, we simply are saying essentially that what we write down is true. Right, so if I write not P and P, what I'm saying is that not P and P is true. So for example, I'm saying that Joe is not tired and Joe is tired is true. Right, and in the second step, then I would say Joe is tired is true as well. Right, so for everything that I'm writing down, I could say, I could append to it is true. That's what it means when I'm writing something down in a proof, right, that what I'm writing down is true. Now, this is a valid rule of inference simplification because, as we can see, if we already know that the first one, not P and P, is true, as we can see from the truth table in the top, oops, this is not what I wanted to do. Wait a minute. Here in this corner, right, if we know that this border is orange and there is only one case in which it is orange, then we know that both elements inside of it are also going to be true. So what we can do with the simplification is that if we know, we can know that if we have a conjunction and this conjunction is true, then we can take the latter element usually and write it down standalone. And this is how rules of inference work, right? We go from one sentence that we know to be true, and we derive from it sentences that are also true. And if we can do that successfully, then it's considered valid, and we've seen before what it would mean to be valid. And if we can't do that if we can't do that successfully, then it's not valid. Right? The simplification is a valid rule of inference, whereby if we have, again, a conjunction, we can just take one element standalone. And it's going to become apparent why we would want to do that later. So, okay, let's continue a little proof here, right? We'll move on, and we're going to write this little thing. And this is something that is very weird, again, for people who just start in logic. And it's called a addition, right? And it might become more intuitive when I explain it. So as I said, right, when we do rules of inference, right, we move from one sentence that is true, and we derive from it other sentences that are true, that have to be true because of the sentence from which we derived it. So P or A, that wedge there stands for an or, so this is a disjunction, and A could be any proposition, literally any proposition. So for example, let's say that we started, just to make it more concrete, because I constantly forget to put good examples. So let's say that P stands for Joe is tired. So we have so far, Joe is not tired and Joe is tired. Then we derive from that Joe is tired. And then now with the third one, we can say Joe is tired, or, the earth is flat. A could be literally any proposition that we want. Okay.
So that's why I'm always tired.
First, but then that might be the case. See, flat earth is the reason why you're tired. Anyway, right, the reason why we can do that, which sounds weird, because why would it be possible for you to just slap on anything onto that and it still be considered a good thing to do, is because if we just look at the truth table, we're going to see that for an OR operator, right, as we said, it's always true when at least one of the elements in it is true, right? So in the upper here we have both are true, so we can see that the thing is true. And here we have just the left one being true, so the whole thing is true. And in here we have the right one being true, and so the whole thing is true. So what we can do is, if we have already something that we know to be true, in this case, P, right? Because we already derived that, we already said, okay, this is going to be true. We can safely do a disjunction with any proposition that we want, and still we will know that that disjunction is going to be true. Why? Because we know that one of these elements in here is true. And so the entire disjunction has to be true because at least one of the elements is true. So this is why this is a valid inference as well.
So looking at this, so you've got your four squares there, and technically, because we already know that P is true, the bottom right one is excluded. Yes. So actually, there's only 3 left.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good way to think about it. It's only 3 left, and all of them are true, right? So it's literally impossible for it. Like, it doesn't matter what A is. A might be true or A might be false, but it doesn't matter. The whole disjunction is going to be true, because we know that at least one is true, and that's all that matters for the disjunction to go through, right? Okay, so this is how far we've developed the argument so far. Okay, so now let's move quickly to the next point, which is going to be weird and perhaps pedantic. And actually, this is like, usually in logic you skip this step because it's so pedantic. But we mentioned it briefly before, right? For conjunctions and disjunctions, it's irrelevant whether or not which order the two pieces are in, right? So it can be that, Joe is tired and Dave is tired is the same as Dave is tired and Joe is tired, right? It's the same thing, logically speaking. So if we know that one is true, then the other one will be true as well. That's why we can sort of invert the order of the elements in a conjunction. And this is usually done so that we can then do the same thing that we already did in the second step, which is simplify. Because if you, like, magicians tend to be very sort of pedantic about things. And so, like, technically simplification as a rule, as the way it is defined, is that you can take only sort of the latter piece of a conjunction and take it away and isolate it, right? You can't take the first element, you have to take the second element. And so that's why you first do a commutation so you can take the second element. But it's like, it's usually just simplified. You usually write them together. You write sort of commutation, simplification together in one step, so that you can sort of just get to the step that you want to get to. But so now, if we want to summarize before we do the last bit, right? We have so Joe is not tired and Joe is tired. This is the first step. Second step, Joe is tired. Third step, Joe is tired or the earth is flat. Then we just inverted the members here, and we said, Joe is tired and Joe is not tired, which is a commutation, just inverting them. And then we simplified the second bit now that it is isolated, and we simplified it. And so we wrote just, Joe is not tired, because we can simplify this for the same reasons as before. But now we get to the weird bit, to the very weird bit, which is this, that we can get in the sixth step just A standalone. And this is because of a disjunctive syllogism, which is, again, a valid rule of inference. And we are going to see why that is the case, right? Because if we look at the disjunction, the step 3, right? What that means when we say that the disjunction is true is that at least one of the elements is true, right? And in step 5, we're saying that, not P, meaning that if that negation is true, then P is false, right? But if P is false, right, then for that disjunction to be true, the only way that disjunction can be true is if A is true. Because if A is false as well, then it wouldn't be true that P or A, right? Because that sort of doesn't work. Then the disjunction would be false, as we can see sort of in this in this square here. I mean, the easiest way to think about it, I guess, is to cancel out the different squares. So when we get to step 3, we are saying that this is not the case, right? This one can't be. Right? Everything else is good, but this bottom one can't be. And then when we get to the 5th step, we're saying essentially that we're eliminating this, right? Because we're saying that the negation in this case, let's say of P, right? So this is the one that is true. Yeah. Sorry, that it looks horrible. I can't draw whatever. But now, if you look at this, now I'm sorry that there are no letters in this bottom one, because there are too many letters here. But what it means is if we have P, if we imagine that the bottom right one in the lower sort of truth table is representative of not P, then we can know that whatever is inside of that negation is false, right? So we can know that P is false. But if P is false, right, that would mean that at least one of the elements in the disjunction of before is false. So we can eliminate that. Oops, it's wrong color. Let me just check. So we can eliminate that top one as well, right? And we have just 2 things left on screen here, just the bits, right? But since we know that that the red element is P, because we know that P is false, that means that whatever remains there has to be true, and whatever remains in this case is A. Right? And so this is how disjunctive syllogism works, and this is why disjunctive syllogism is valid in classical logic in general. But now, just to recap where we are now, right? We have, Joe is not tired and Joe is tired. Then we have Joe is tired. Then we have Joe is tired or the earth is flat. Then we have Joe is tired and Joe is not tired. Then we have Joe is not tired. And at the end of it, therefore, the earth is flat. And that is a bit of a problem. Because we've just gone from a contradiction, and we derive from this contradiction that the earth is flat. And it's crucial to note that this proposition, right, the latter one, that the earth is flat, could be literally any proposition that we want. Could be whatever you want. And this little thing, which is a proof in logic that exists, right, is called the principle of explosion. So if we want to look at it, like from a definitional standpoint, a logical consequence is explosive if, according to it, a contradiction entails everything, right? So if you have a system of logic and you can have a contradiction, and from it you can get literally any other proposition, then that system of logic is explosive. That from a contradiction, everything follows. And this, by the way, entails something that's called triviality, which means that, literally from a contradiction in classical logic, everything is true. Right? If you get a contradiction, a teeny tiny contradiction somewhere, you can derive everything. You can derive literally whatever you want. And now you might think, well, okay, we have explosion in classical logic. Like some people, to be fair, think about it differently, and we'll see later on what it means and all of that. But this little thing is, you might think, well, it's not that problematic because there are no contradictions, right? If there is a contradiction, then some of the premises is wrong. And so, we just, like, as long as we don't get into a contradiction, and if we get into contradiction, we can solve this contradiction by just sort of changing the premises on something, then we are fine, right? We are fine because, as long as we don't get into contradiction, we are not getting explosion. So this might be a way of thinking about it, but I want to offer a little example here now. So let's say that we have a planet, an alien planet. And on this alien planet, there are a few different kind of creatures, people. Let's just call them people for now, right? And we have tall people, and these tall people have sort of orange hair and red hair. And then we have like tiny people, and these tiny people have, all of them in the history of the planet, always have had red hair. Now, this is also sort of a very early stage of development. The society is really sort of unfair to people. It's like they're really nasty, and these taller people are dominating on this planet. And among them, one of the things, like there are rankings among these people, right, among these taller people, and like persons with orange hair are considered like the elite on this planet. So the orange-haired tall people just say, make up a rule, they go, and since they have the power in the government, they just make it legal for people with orange hair to vote. They pass a law that says it is legal for people with orange hair to vote. Right, and then they remind themselves that there are these other people, these tiny people with red hair, and these people really don't like the tiny people, right? Taller people dislike tiny people for some reason. And so they want to discriminate against them. And so they pass another law and they say, well, it is illegal for short people to vote because we don't want shorter people to vote. Because again, these are nasty people. So we have two laws now that get passed, and everything is fine, right? Because like for years and years and maybe centuries, however you want, like nothing happens. It's just fine. But then one day, a very peculiar thing happens. Right? We get a tiny person with orange hair, which has never happened in the history of the planet because all tiny people so far have had red hair. So now we have a tiny person with orange hair. And let's call this person Dylan, right? Because, I don't know, Dialetheia, I guess, something like that. Just to give him a bit of personality. I don't know.
I like it.
So now you have a bit of a problem here now, because you can make a few arguments here for Dylan, right? You can say, if it is legal for people with orange hair to vote, then it is legal for Dylan to vote. I mean, this seems fair enough, right? Because the law literally says it is legal for people with orange hair to vote, right? Her premise true is literally just citing the law. So it's true by definition, more or less. And then 3 follows, therefore, it is legal for Dylan to vote, right? So this is modus ponens. It's a valid rule of inference. Now, to be fair, the first premise, I could have written it differently. I could have written it like in terms of, predicate logic, right? That's how you usually do it. Or you could write it in categorical logic as well. For all x, if x has orange hair, then x has a right to vote, and then you just do a universal instantiation. But bottom line, what I'm trying to say here is that the premise 1, I just simplified it for the sake of this presentation, but you can prove it right from the law itself. You can show that it like this conditional essentially follows, because it's a universal instantiation of the law, essentially. Okay. Now, this is the first argument that you can make, and then you can make a second argument, which is if it is illegal for short people to vote, then it is illegal for Dylan to vote because Dylan is short. So it is illegal for short people to vote because, again, that's just the law. That's literally just citing the law. And then you get to that, therefore, it is illegal for Dylan to vote. And now you might have figured it out by now that if you combine these 2 little things, you get a nice and wonderful conclusion, which is, therefore, it is legal for Dylan to vote, and it is illegal for Dylan to vote. And for the sharpest among you, it's going to be quite evident that this is a contradiction. Now, I want to explain briefly why this is sort of problematic for someone that is like in the framework of classical logic. Because if you recall from before, right, you can, like, classical logic is explosive, at least there's a good case to be made that classical logic is explosive. And by explosive, it means that from a contradiction, literally everything follows. Now, what you would have to do as a classical logician, if you don't like this outcome, is deny one of the premises, right? So in the first argument, you have two premises, but it's literally pretty much impossible to deny any of these premises, because the first one is just sort of a conditional, a universal instantiation of the law, and the second one is just citing, actually, no, it's a combination of just a factual observation that Dylan has orange hair and the law. And it would be very hard for you as a classical logician to deny any of the premises, because what premises are you going to deny? That Dylan has orange hair? I don't think so. And you're also not going to deny that it is legal for people with orange hair to vote, because that's literally the law. Now, what is usually happening is that people say, well, I don't like this, right? I don't want that this law exists. So I'll just say, well, it might be the law, but it shouldn't be the law, right? It is wrong for it to be in the law like this. And it's true, right? I might even agree with that. And even a person that, like sort of a dialetheist, as we're going to see, or sort of a paraconsistent logician might agree with you. But the fact of the matter is that right now, in this very moment, whether you like it or not, it is the law. Right? And it doesn't matter really whether or not it should be the law or not, but the fact of the matter is that it is the law. So it doesn't make sense to deny that premise and to say, right, this premise is wrong because it shouldn't be the case, right? Because it doesn't matter what it should be, it matters what it is. And the fact is that it is the case, that this is the law. So this is where things are problematic now, because, of course, when you get to the contradiction, right, you can have a lot of fun with this, right? So it's legal for Dylan to vote, and it's illegal for Dylan to vote. And so of course,
before you continue,
that there's an invisible donkey in Joe's room. Yes.
Sorry. Before you continue, Luke asks if it's valid, because obviously both separate syllogisms were valid, but because you ended up with a contrary conclusion combining the two, does it still count as valid?
Yes. So yeah, this is perfectly, like, this is just valid. In classical logic, this can be proven to be valid. Like, as I said, both of these syllogisms are modus ponens, and modus ponens is a valid argument structure. We haven't looked at it before, but it is a valid argument. And of course, once you get to 3 and to 6, right, these are separately the two separate conclusions, and then it is of course valid to do a conjunction. And conjunction simply means that you take the individual pieces and you put them together in a conjunction. That is also a valid inference that you can do. When you have individual pieces that are true, you can make a conjunction out of them. So yes, this is valid, right? The thing that you should question as a logician is not whether or not this is valid, because it's self-evidently valid to a person that is familiar with logic. The thing that you should question is whether or not it is sound. But it is very hard to question the soundness of this argument, because it's based on literal just observation of the facts, right? One observation is that Dylan has orange hair, and the other observation is that there is a law that says this thing.
Yeah, so basically, individually, both parts are sound. Both parts are sound individually, yes, and then you just join them together.
Both arguments are valid and sound, and therefore the conclusion that it is legal for Dylan to vote and it is illegal for Dylan to vote is also is like a sound argument that leads to that. So it is a true conclusion, right? If you take the premises to be true, which it's very hard to deny, I would say it's almost impossible to deny, then you get to a conclusion that is also true. And if you take explosion in classical logic to be the case, which we've looked at the proof before, then you can say something like, it is legal for Dylan to vote and it is illegal for Dylan to vote. So it follows that again, there's an invisible donkey in Joe's room, or that the earth is flat, or even that the earth is not flat. You can deduce like it and the contradiction from it, and you can deduce a whole bunch of say like your phone number is whatever you want, right? And in fact, on this note, there is a very neat little thing that I found.
XKCD.
So you can take the time, I guess. Yeah, I think so, yes.
I do like XKCD. They're brilliant. If you assume contradictory axioms, you can derive anything. It's called the principle of explosion. Anything? Let me try. Hey, you're right. I started with P and not P. There you go. There's different symbols being used there, but
Exactly,
actually,
that's a different symbol, yes.
Yeah, and derived your mum's phone number. That's not how it works. Mrs. Lenhart? Wait, that is her number. How? Hi, I'm a friend of... Why, yes, I am free tonight. Mum! No, box wine sounds lovely. Brilliant.
So this is what you get yourself into with explosion, right? That when you have contradictory, you get to a contradiction, right? Everything follows from it. If you take explosion to be a thing. And again, this is leading to triviality because, like, you can derive literally any proposition from it, which means that every proposition is true. Whatever proposition you can come up with, it's going to be true. And even those that you cannot come up with are going to be true as well. Everything is going to be true once you get to a contradiction.
Does everyone accept the principle of explosion?
Yes, that's a good question. Now we're going to see what it means to reject the principle of explosion, right? Because actually that brings me perfectly to the next thing, right? So we're now going to explain what paraconsistency is. So a logical consequence is paraconsistent if and only if it is not exclusive. So paraconsistent logics are logics within which the principle of explosion is not a thing, right? So that from a contradiction, not everything follows. And you can do that in a number of ways, right? Like in classical logic, there exists this proof for explosion, which has been a hotly debated topic since like ages. I guess one way of doing that is simply to say, well, once you violate one of the three axioms of logic, of classical logic, then you cannot really continue anything further, right? Then you should sort of interrupt everything, right? That's sort of a way to get around it, even if it's not the most like elegant way to get around it, because it's just sort of not let's not look at what it would mean for one of these things to be different. It's just sort of you can't go further, right? Like you have to stop. It's weird, but then it's also weird because you like what would you say in the instance of sort of the syllogism before with Dylan, right? Like you can say, okay, well I can't go further, but like what am I going to do with this? Like I can't reason anymore. Or what does happen? Right? Because once you get to something like that, then it's very hard to figure out what to do next. Because if you want to go further, then you're going to have a problem, right? You're going to have a big problem because then everything is explosive. Like if you want to continue, then and continue to use axioms and other things in classical logic and operators and all of that, then you're going to get to explosive results. So like you would have to stop all reasoning from that point on in a way. So that's also not ideal. It's a bit weird. Another thing that I wanted to stop for a minute on is the notion with the Dylan example that, well, you know, that is only a thing because we had a contradiction to begin with or something like that. Or that is only a thing because we sort of said that that's a thing. Something like that, which is like I'm going to grant that, right? Like that's not a problem in the sense that it is true that we got to a contradictory result with Dylan only because there were two laws there that were essentially contradicting each other because there was like no expectation of them being contradictory when in fact they were contradictory. Because as I said, right, that law worked just fine until Dylan showed up. Because before that, there were no problems. Nobody even thought that it could be contradictory, and then it like became contradictory at some point. But it's only true that because of the tension at the beginning, that was the case. But that's still like I want to stress that really doesn't really matter that much, or doesn't matter as much as you would think, because even though you can say, well, these sorts of things happen only in systems, for example, that are man-made, where errors can happen, it is still the case that, first of all, these things can happen because like we've had laws that were inconsistent at times, and we had to change them. But the problem is that if they can happen, like in the period where they are a thing, like if you would want to be a systematic classical logician in a sense, you would have a bit of trouble in that situation, because like it doesn't, like, sure, it matters that they at the beginning were inconsistently put together the laws, but like you still cannot deny that's the law, right? Like it still feels wrong for you to deny one of the premises, because it's still the case that that's the law. Even if it was a mistake, it's still the case that that's the law. So you're still in a very awkward position where, you know, you would sort of have to either stop all further reasoning from that point on, or sort of accept that everything explodes and then everything is true. So those are like two things that I wanted to mention briefly.
Can we see these contradictions happening in non-man-made things?
Yeah, we're gonna get to that at the end.
Spoilers, sorry.
Yes, no. It's a good question. It's a good question. We're gonna get to that, because like that is gonna be like even more controversial than what we already illustrated so far, right? But for example, like just to say something that might make you relax a bit, right? Like Aristotelian syllogistic logic is paraconsistent. That's something that very few people expect, but it is paraconsistent, because you cannot, like, if you just work with classical Aristotelian logic, you cannot prove explosion from those sort of method. Within that framework, you cannot prove explosion. So even though that is a thing that is incorporated into classical logic nowadays, and it's still a valid way to reason on its own, that particular system of logic is paraconsistent. Just so to say, it's not like a super exotic thing. Like paraconsistency is not like that exotic. It's been a thing for a while now, although it wasn't meant to be paraconsistent, right? Like, because Aristotle is himself, right, one of the people who really pushed the law of non-contradiction. But still, right, if you just reason within classical Aristotelian logic, you're not going to get to explosive things with a contradiction. So that is already a safe system, for instance, right? So paraconsistent logics are simply logics that can take a beating, in a sense, right? They can take a contradiction, and you can still continue and be fine and not have everything explode in your face. So that's what it means for a system of logic to be paraconsistent. Okay, are there any questions or?
No. I think Luke is just working through some logical proofs in the chat right now where he's worked out that you're a reptilian.
Okay. Great. Okay. Yeah.
He's using what you're teaching him well.
Yeah.
But
okay,
no.
So let's.
Sorry, I was just saying, yeah, it's making sense so far. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now we'll move on to the really weird stuff.
Wicked.
So, like, if you thought that this was weird so far, now we're going to get into the really weird stuff. Because the reason, like, the main motivation of development of paraconsistent logics, and this is one of the things that is actually quite recent, right? Even though I just said that Aristotelian logic is paraconsistent, but they really didn't realize it or thought about it really, about it being paraconsistent. That was not considered a feature. But the reason why like paraconsistent logics were developed is because you can get to these sort of errors. And even like, for example, in computing systems, like in computing systems where you have the possibility of errors, it is better to have a system of logic that can take errors and not just, say that everything is true after that, but actually, take it easy and just move on, even if it has an inconsistency inside of it. that is a motivation for the development. But it started all with these sorts of things. And these are sort of problems that, to be fair, were known for a while now. These are sort of paradoxes. So let's take a look at this example. Right? So we have Plato, and Plato is saying what Socrates is saying is true. And Socrates is saying that what Plato is saying is false. Now, but if what Plato is saying is false, then that which Socrates is saying is not true. It's false. But then what I just said is false, and so on. Right? They move in circles. They're sort of they're what is called Elias Paradox or liar paradox. It's a liar paradox that is sort of done in two steps with two different distinct entities, but it's a liar paradox nonetheless. There are these sort of weird things, weird sentences, weird propositions that seem to be contradictory, like because of the way they are set up. Another very, very famous example is the following: this statement is false, right? Okay, let's suppose that the statement is false. So what it is saying is not true. But if it's not true, then what it is saying it's not true. It's not false. It's true. But if it's true, then what it is saying is that it is false. So it's false. And you get to a contradiction very quickly here as well. So that is another example. Now, a very popular solution lately is to say simply that, well, there are statements, there are propositions that, you cannot really assign a truth value to them, either because they're self-referential or something like that, right? If you see a statement like that, then you can't touch them, right? And that's the idea that there are propositions, that there are gaps, right, in our propositions or in sentences that cannot have truth values assigned to them. Because they're just meaningless or otherwise. Because otherwise you get these sorts of weird things where you get a sentence that is self-contradictory, and you get to a contradiction very fast. The problem with this sort of solution is that there are other types of paradoxes, actually not other types of paradoxes, the same types of paradoxes, but like they're called revenge liars or sort of extended liar paradoxes. Strengthened liar paradoxes, something like that, which sort of resist even this sort of objection. And like an example would be this type of sentence, right? This sentence is not true. Now, you might think at first glance, well, wait a minute, that's the same as saying that this sentence is false, but that's really not the case, because as we said, we just opened up to the possibility of this sentence being maybe even meaningless or otherwise, right? So let's look at this, right? What does it mean? What it would mean is that the sentence is either false, right? Because it could be false, or neither true or false, because it could be meaningless, right? It could be something else. So that is the thing, right? Because we're saying that it's not true, it means that it's either false or meaningless or something else. And you can add as many other sort of exceptions here as you would want, right? But the problem here is that in both cases, right, that false or neither true nor false or meaningless or whatever else you want to put in here, the sentence is not true, right? Because simply we're not saying that it's true. Right? But then what this would mean is that the sentence is what it claims to be, because it is saying that it is not true. Right? So it is true. But if it is true, then this contradicts directly the first sentence, which is not true, right? So we have a little problem here as well. Even if we add this idea of like meaningless statements, right? So you can say, well, it might be a meaningless statement. So okay, let's look at it, right? It could be false or meaningless. But if it's false or meaningless, that means that it's not true. And if it's not true, then what it is saying is true, and so it is true, and so on, right? So you have, again, the problems. And these are sort of revenge liar paradoxes that are causing a bit of a problem for people who want to sort of exit these type of paradoxes this way. So, okay, what are other solutions? And now we're going to get to the really controversial bit. Because there are people that just say, you know what, well, if we can't get out of this, let's just bite the bullet and say that, contradictions like these can be true, right? That there are true contradictions. And then we're going to get to something called Dialetheism, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And Dialetheism is the view that there are true contradictions. Right? And Dialetheism is largely a result of these sort of Elias paradoxes, but it could also be applied to the previous example, for example, with Dylan, right? So that there can be true contradictions, right? That's what the view Dialetheism is saying. Now, the major proponent of this view, the one that has led to its development, and it's also like there are many people nowadays that respect this sort of view, even though it was really controversial when introduced. And to be fair, it's still very controversial. But like many people can at least see the value of getting out of these sorts of paradoxes in this way. Now, I want to just make a note here because it is important for us to understand the difference between Dialetheism and paraconsistency, because sometimes they get mixed up. So a Dialetheist, right, has to use some sort of paraconsistent system if he wants to avoid trivialism. And trivialism is the view that everything is true, right? So if you want to avoid the idea that everything is true, you'll have to work within a paraconsistent system. Because if you're not going to work within a paraconsistent system, then you're going to get to explosion. And since you accept that there are some true contradictions, from that everything follows, and then you're going to get into trivialism, right? But since you don't want that, you want to work with paraconsistent logics. But someone working with paraconsistent logics might not be a Dialetheist, right? Someone with that works with paraconsistency could be like just working with paraconsistency. It's not committing him to Dialetheism. Right? So a helpful way to visualize this that I found, and this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is this, right? There are many levels. So there's gentle strength, paraconsistency. So you simply reject the idea of explosion in some form of logical system. Full strength paraconsistency means there are interesting or important theories that are inconsistent but not trivial. So inconsistent would mean that there are contradictions, but not trivial means that that not everything is true because of this inconsistency, essentially, which is what sort of paraconsistency allows you. So this acknowledges the existence of these theories that are important. Industrial strength paraconsistency has it that these sort of theories could also be true, are possibly true, and then dialethic paraconsistency, which is what we just looked at, is the view that there are some inconsistent and non-trivial theories that are true. So there are actually true inconsistencies. And of course, these people are going to reason paraconsistently. Okay. So this is it so far. Like, are there any questions, or can I move on?
No questions from me. But it's really interesting. This is the bit that I was really looking forward to. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's a bit. You have to sort of understand the individual pieces, like what trivialism is. Sort of trivialism is everything is true, and how to avoid that. And now I think, like, for the final bit, I just wanted to show how someone, like how, for example, a dialetheist can avoid explosion, and what it means for him to work with like a paraconsistent system. What would be an example of a paraconsistent system? Because that might be very abstract and not easy to understand if you don't look at it concretely. So one of the ways that you can do this is, and this is the way Graham Priest did it, right? He developed something called LP, which is the logic of paradox. It's a different type of logic. And by the way, this is a great example for people who like say, oh, philosophy doesn't make progress or something like that. Paraconsistent logics are a thing that are very recent, like in the last 100 years or so. So they're not like, they've not been around for ages, at least not, paraconsistent systems that were developed for this sort of purpose. So even things like logic actually do make a lot of progress, and we understand the mathematical aspects of it better, and then we sort of develop it alongside mathematics and all of that.
Maths is philosophy anyway.
And how does it work? I'm sorry?
I said maths is philosophy anyway.
Yeah, but that's a pretty good take. Anyway, like the way this works is, like, the easiest way to do this is with a many-valued logic, and LP is an instance of a many-valued logic, right? Because it's simply the case where, like in classical logic, you have true things and you have false things, right? And these are the only two states that it can be in. And LP, so the logic of paradox, says, you know what? Maybe there's a third option, right? Maybe there is a third state that proposition can be in, which is paradoxical. Paradoxical roughly means that they are true and false at the same time. And so this means that this has an effect on all the things that we looked at previously in classical logic, right? So, for example, we have this, which is a truth table in classical logic of negations. And then magically, if you look at the truth table in LP, it looks something like this, right? You have a third state. And this third state is like the state of paradoxical propositions. So if a paradoxical negation is simply like, if the thing inside of a negation is paradoxical, then the negation itself is going to be paradoxical. And this moves to all other things as well, right? So for example, in this case, we're going to just have an expansion and have a bit more squares here to fill. But we have a bunch of other options now, because we have different states. And we can see that a conjunction now, if you have a conjunction between a true state, a true proposition and a paradoxical proposition, then the conjunction is going to be paradoxical. If you're conjoining two paradoxical propositions, then the conjunction is going to be paradoxical. If you're conjoining a paradoxical proposition with a false proposition, like for example here, then it's still going to be false. And yeah, these are the options essentially for conjunctions. And by the way, another thing that is helpful to picture here is that, like, this still retains a lot of its roots from sort of classical logic, because the top right corner, this corner, the bottom right corner, and the bottom left corner are still essentially the same as in classical logic. So it's still the case that if both elements in a conjunction are true, then the conjunction is going to be true. And that's still the only case where a conjunction is true. So that means that a lot of things can still happen. For example, simplification is still a thing, as we're going to see before, because if you can write down, this thing, this conjunction is true, then you can know for sure that both elements are going to be true inside of it. And so you can take one and write it standalone as true. So a lot of inferences from classical logic still work in LP. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Okay, so then we'll just move on to this, right? We'll expand this a bit as well. So we have here a few others, right? With a disjunction, see that the disjunction between paradoxical propositions is paradoxical. Disjunction between a paradoxical proposition and a true proposition is true, and a disjunction between a paradoxical proposition and a false proposition is paradoxical. And all the rest carries over. And then finally, conditionals are like in a similar vein. So if the antecedent is true and the consequent is false, then it's paradoxical. I mean, I don't know if it's helpful for me to just name all of these examples separately. I think you can just look at them visually here. I don't know if it makes sense for me to go all of them. But essentially, right, there are a bunch of other options now when you have this third possible value. And now for the final bit, what does it mean now for a little proof of explosion in classical logic, right? So if we take a look back at here, we're going to see P. And one of the things that is going to become immediately apparent is that if we have negation and its content both in a conjunction, then the only way this can be a thing is if the whole thing is paradoxical, meaning that both elements are going to be paradoxical. So we're going to tint it in blue here. So let's continue down the line, right? We have simplification here. But this is a bit weird, right? Because first of all, another thing, I said before that in logic, when you write down things in steps, usually it usually means that what I'm writing down is true. In this case, I'm going to, it's still the case, from what I know, that this in LP is still the case, right? That if you write something down, you mean that thing is true. But in order for me to explain better why explosion doesn't follow here, I'm going to just take it and tint it in blue. And let's take that the first one doesn't mean that not P and P is true. It's more like the not P and P taken together is a paradoxical thing, which actually means that it's true and false at the same time. But let's leave it aside, because this is just going to help us in the future here. So let's take a look at the truth table here for our thing. And we're going to see that if we have a paradoxical thing, right, we can't really derive from it and write something standalone as true, because if we know that one is paradoxical, then it can be, let me sort of cut off all the options, right? We know it's paradoxical, so it has to be one of
the 5 middle ones.
These 3 squares here in the middle, right? Yeah, exactly. So one of those 3 has to be the case, right? But since it can be the case that both of them are paradoxical, or one of them is paradoxical and one of them is true, but we don't know which one of these is going to be true and which one is going to be paradoxical, a simplification simply doesn't follow if we have something that is paradoxical. As I said before, if we have something that is true, right? If we had, for example, A and B or something, and these were different propositions, right? And I would write that down, right? I would write A and B, and that would signify A and B is true. Then I could still simplify both A and B from it, because then it would basically means that none of these are the case, right? Because it has to be true. And so the only way for it to be true is if both of them are true. And so I can safely write that in the next line, take one of those elements standalone, because I know that it sort of maintains truth value. But in this case, since we did this weird thing, right, where we know that the first one is paradoxical, then we not simplify, right? And here it already breaks down, right? Here you can already see why we cannot get to explosion with this system, right? But let's, for the fun of it, say, since we know at present exactly what value P has, because we are sort of in this omniscient position, we know that P is paradoxical. And so we can sort of, for the fun of it, continue to see how else it breaks down, right? So here we have the addition, so P or A, and the story is kind of similar, right? Because here it's really clear why this is a problem. Because we know that P is paradoxical, but we have no idea really what A is. And because we have no idea what A is, the whole thing, disjunction could be either paradoxical or it could be true, because basically what we can remove is, because we know that one element is paradoxical, we can remove this top one, right? That's not going to be the case. That's not going to be the case, because at least one has to be paradoxical. That's not going to be the case, and that's not going to be the case. So we're leaving with the cross inside of it, yeah. But since we have here both elements that are paradoxical, for example, if A is paradoxical itself, then the whole thing is going to be paradoxical, because then it's going to be in the middle. The thing in the middle is going to be the thing, right? So we know that then 3 is going to be paradoxical. But if A is, say, true, then the whole thing would be true and not paradoxical. So since we don't know what the value of A is, and the value of A determines whether or not the whole disjunction is true or not, that is sort of a problem. And of course, if it's false, then it would be paradoxical. So there are many different options here. And the problem is that we don't know, the value of A determines, so basically the value of the Earth is flat, if you want to take the example of that, determines whether or not this whole thing is paradoxical, or if it's true. And since we cannot be sure about it, right, we can't really, like, it doesn't follow. Addition doesn't follow in this case, right? You can't do that. But again, like, if we just ignore it for a while, right, the commutation aspect would still be a thing. It would be sort of a weird commutation here because we have a commutation of a paradoxical thing, right? But it's still the case, right? It doesn't matter the order, doesn't matter, that should be fine. But the simplification, for the same reason as before, doesn't follow. And then finally, the disjunctive syllogism, we have the same problems that they've just explained, right? We cannot really guarantee it being true, because because it depends on what 3 is. Now, if 3, we could say, like, that 3, the disjunction is definitely true, right? Then we could know that A is true. Because if we would know that the disjunction is true, then we could eliminate all of these rows here. Actually, no, let me redo that, right? We could eliminate this and this. And since we know that one of them is paradoxical, we could eliminate also this and this, and then we would just be left with 3 sort of things in the top left. And since we know that one of them is paradoxical, it follows like the other one has to be true, and so it would be true, right? But this is assuming a whole host of different things that we already left out, and we went through a whole host of inferences that are not valid and broken down, and that don't follow in LP, and it's a whole mess already. So this is, and again, we don't know whether or not 3 is true or not, right? Because we can't do that, because that depends on A. And of course, if it's paradoxical, then something similar would happen, and A could be false as well, or paradoxical. So since we don't know, it just remains an open question, and the disjunctive syllogism also falls out of the water and doesn't work. So as you can see here in this proof, right, a lot of things from the very simple things at the beginning start to break down in LP. And so, it stops working really. And so you cannot prove explosion in the logic of paradox that Graham Priest created. And so with this, now that I explained why sort of explosion doesn't follow in this type of logic, I think I'm done for tonight. And so thank you. And I hope that you learned something.
No, thank you. Definitely.
That was amazing, Philip. Thank you.
Really, really, really good. Yeah. I have to say, I think I'm going to have to rewatch some of that as well myself. Because it's one of those things. Yeah, like my mind's a little bit on fire. I think BT Toast said something that was very relevant when they joined in, and it was that their brain was buffering. And that's a very good way of describing it. It's like, wow, there's all this information and all these different ideas spinning around coming off of it, and it was all very, very good and very informative. But I think it's something that I definitely need to check out again. And it's explained a few things and put a few things in a different way that I hadn't considered before, and it's actually helped me, I suppose, defrag my hard drive a little bit, but at the same time loaded a hell of a lot of stuff on top.
Yeah, no, I get that, right? Like, because we went through a lot, and like even the basics of logic, it takes a time, and sometimes it happens, I think, to everyone, that it's just like you get to the point where you're just questioning, like, why is that again the thing? Like, how does it? Like, it happens to me all the time that I look again at the truth table, and then I'm starting to wonder, why that doesn't make sense. And it's happened to me again countless of times to sort of recheck everything that I have learned and sort of try to figure out, well, why is that a thing, and how can that be? For example, the whole thing with conditionals, right, and the fact that a conditional can be true even like if you have completely unrelated things that are both true. Like, that took me a while to understand, like, how that works and why it works, and how am I supposed to now think about it if I can just look at the individual things and think them both true? But then should I think that the conditional is true? All these sorts of things. So it's weird. And then if you get into the weirder things, right, like paraconsistency and Dialetheism and all that stuff, then it just compounds on top of that, and like it's a lot. I get that it's a lot, but I hopefully at least sort of sparked some like a look into maybe that there is more to logic than just sort of the little things that are usually talked about, and that there's a whole universe of things out there that even question things like the law of non-contradiction. Even though you might think that it is a thing that is helpful, or you might think that it's total crap and that it's a bad development, but it's at least useful to see sort of the motivations and why these things sort of exist and why they came to be, and that I find helps to strengthen sort of the understanding of the whole thing.
So Luke's actually got a question for you. He says, is the point of LP to remove explosion, so in order to prevent everything from being possible?
Yes, so LP is a paraconsistent logic. Now, there are many types, and there are many ways you can approach paraconsistent logics, but that is one type of it that allows you to reason with, like, even with contradictions in your system, right? Because if you get to a contradiction, that's, it's bad, but it's not like life-ending or explosive as it would be in more of a classical system, where it's like harder to figure out how and why explosion doesn't occur. With LP, you can just continue, and it has a few things in it that are interesting. Like, it retains a lot of classical logic, like a lot of inferences from classical logic still work, because the truth tables retain like a lot of the values from classical logic. They have the same sort of configurations. But there are some inferences that don't work in LP. For example, one big one is no disponents. No disponents is not valid in LP because of this sort of considerations. Now, I haven't drawn up a truth table, but I'm going to trust that if the SEP says that it's not valid, then they have good reason to say that it's not valid. And probably if you draw up the truth table, you'll see why it's not valid with inference, what is permanence in that. Like a few things I wanted to just briefly say now at the end. Like, Joe, you asked if there are people who think that there are true contradictions, like even in the real world.
As in natural things. There are some
philosophers that think there are natural things, yes. For example, Graham Priest thinks, if I'm not mistaken, that movement is paradoxical. And by movement, he refers to sort of Zeno's paradoxes of movement. The arrow paradox, for example, that before it gets to the target, it has to do half that, and before it does that, it has to do half that, and blah, 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 and so on. And he thinks that you can solve that by saying something, that the state of movement is paradoxical. It means to be here and not here at the same time, right? So that you're in a state, but also already somewhere else at the same time. Like, if you can wrap your head around that, then good. I personally can't. But that's, for example, one avenue where people think that sort of inconsistencies can occur. Another thing that I wanted to point out, because this is so common, like there are so many people that are going to go, right, oh, well, if you're a Dialetheist, then I can just like say the opposite of what you're saying, and you're not going to be able to say that I'm wrong because you can say that there are contradictions and stuff, right? You think that contradictions can subsist. And the answer to that is, like, that is a very cheap way to look at sort of Dialetheism, because crucially, Dialetheism is not the view that like everything, like all contradictions are true. But typically, Dialetheists are very, very specific on what they think, on what types of contradictions they think are true. They definitely don't think that everything can be just negated and it's going to be a true contradiction. So that is not a really good critique, right? Like, the only thing that it leaves open is that whenever you say that, oh, well, this is whenever you negate something, you have to be sort of open to the possibility as a dialetheist that whatever you have in front of you is actually a true contradiction, right? But if you, like for the most part, you could just live your life as a normal classical logician, and like you'll have to leave this thing open. And in fact, a lot of dialetheists will even be happy to admit that, for example, saying that there is a true contradiction in any specific case, for example, the Elias Paradox case, comes with a heavy cost, right? They'll take the acceptance of a true contradiction as a theoretical cost, right? As you would take sort of simplicity and all sorts of things, like doesn't have enough explanatory power, doesn't have is more complex, or it's not simple.
Oh, we lost you there, Philip.
If I'm sorry.
Sorry, we just lost you there. Yeah, you're back.
Yeah. So what I was saying is simply that a dialetheist considers a contradiction a cost, a theoretical cost, much as, complexity of a theory could be a cost, or poor explanatory power could be a theoretical cost. So could be sort of accepting a true contradiction could be a very high cost. And it is sort of like a last type of measure, right? If there's no way out of this, like maybe we can start to consider the possibility of it actually being truly contradictory, while taking into consideration the fact that this has a hefty theoretical cost. Because even a dialetheist is not going to be all sort of jolly about having true contradictions all the time, right? Even they will try to minimize the amount of true contradictions that they have. It's just that they accept that there are some that are true contradictions.
So they're like, for example, if you're thinking about something that exists, they wouldn't say something both exists and does not exist, or like a light switch being on, they won't say it can be both on and off, sort of that sort of thing.
Yeah, I don't think so. I like, as I said, I don't know if like how long did I black out?
Just a split second.
What was the last thing that? Oh, okay. So yeah, as I said, Graham Priest thinks like about time. That time sort of is that movement is dialethic. Yeah, but I don't know about switches. Like I don't think, like, if there's no reason to, like, I think you would have to be sort of forced. There would have to be a really weird situation in which you would be happy, or at least sort of begrudgingly, I guess, accept a true contradiction. Even as a dialetheist, you would try to minimize the amount of true contradictions that you have. But if there is no other way around it, then a dialetheist will say, well, thank you very much, then okay, then I'm going to take it, right? And he's not going to do a big fuss about it, while like he's going to say, for example, yeah, this has a huge theoretical cost, but the alternatives are all worse, so I'm going to take this huge theoretical cost and I'm going to just run with it because I think it's overall still the best theory, while other people are going to just sort of categorically say no, I don't think that can be a thing. And so about light switches, I don't know. I think I tend not to speak about quantum mechanics because I genuinely don't think that I'm competent enough to speak about quantum mechanics, and the amount of people that speak about quantum mechanics that pretend to know quantum mechanics while they don't is overwhelming. So I don't want to fall into that category, but it just seems to me that there might be something there, because we know that there are weird things happening with sort of a superposition within quantum mechanics. So that might be an avenue where dialetheists say that is a true contradiction. I don't know though, right? Like I'm genuinely not. Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah, sure. That makes sense. I mean, it does make more sense for it to be used as an extreme circumstance, or as sort of a check, like could this in any way, shape, or form end up as a contradiction? And certain things, like the existence of something in a given moment, at least, can't be true and false in that regard. And yeah, okay.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I'm not a dialetheist myself. Like, if we look at the scale before, I was full at like around 3, I think. Right, I'm open to the possibility of some of them being there being true contradictions, but I'm not moving myself toward that. I'm not confidently saying that there are true contradictions. I don't think so. At least maybe in human-made systems as the law before, then there I would be there I would say that. Yeah, of course, there can be true contradictions if contradictory laws are made at the start. But I don't think that there are true contradictions in nature, for example.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I can't. It was. I remember you giving me the law example before because I'd spent a lot of time trying to think about how these contradictions could actually work, and all of the things I was thinking of were nature, and it was the case that
Can
sorry.
I close the
yeah close it
thing?
Yeah, go for it. We'll go back to the main screen.
Oops. Okay.
So yeah, and I spent a lot of time thinking and trying to find these contradictions, trying to actually understand how someone could think that there were these true contradictions. And I couldn't find anything because I was focusing on these natural systems. And then you gave me that law example, and it was like, right, yeah, okay, no, that makes sense. And I'm still trying to work on finding where it could rest within something natural. And the only time I can think of it is things which have had human categorizations on top of natural things. So again, it comes down to a sort of linguistic human construct type thing. So again, I can't think of anything that is natural. I disagree with the movement one, because I mean, in any given split of a moment, you are where you are. That is where you are. You're not both there and not there at that exact moment.
I agree. I agree with that. It's just that the Zeno's paradoxes would be sort of like, if you can infinitely split time in a way, right, you would never get anywhere. So I guess the motivation behind that is just to say, well, there has to be some way for it to be at the same time a split moment there, but also somewhere so that it can sort of tumble over. I don't know though, right? That's just my imagination. Yeah, I think I'm not qualified enough to talk about exactly why he thinks that. But I can see sort of intuitively why he would sort of think that. I just think it's maybe perhaps a bit of a jump from my perspective. I don't know if I would go all the way, confidently say that is the solution to Zeno's paradoxes, something like that. So yeah, it's
Dave's book recommendation.
That's a really good book if you want to look at paradoxes.
This sentence is false.
And I mean, it's still an interesting, I find it interesting to think about these things, because as I said, they teach you a lot about logic and how it works and where it breaks and why it breaks and sort of that. And it's fun. It's fun to think about these things. And again, to be fair, I presented I think I presented a lot and probably too much and too much in depth already. But you could go into, you could go into a lot of detail here about all of the objections that have been moved to dialetheism, because I don't want to present it as the be on the end all here, right? There are objections that have been moved to dialetheism. It's not like it's thing. I will say it seems to be increasingly more respected, and especially if paraconsistent logics are being used more and more. But I don't think dialetheism itself is that much. I think it is confined to certain things where people would generally agree that there can be true contradictions, like the law and something like that. But when you move to nature, it's already very, very dicey and much more controversial, and still controversial. Or honestly, dialetheism is still very controversial.
Yeah, that's fair. Got a question from Luke saying, what's the difference between explosion and collapse?
Oh God, collapse. I wouldn't know exactly what it would refer to in.
I mean, I
can context.
Apart from semantic collapse, I guess I could understand, and that's when your terms break down because you end up in a contradiction of terms where you end up with a load of terms muddling across each other. But that's the only use I can think of.
Exactly what.
He also says, is a Dialetheism a lack of belief in contradictions or a belief that contradictions do not exist?
That is
perfect. When he first put that up, it was really hard not to laugh, but I couldn't even say it without giggling.
I know it comes to my mind, another thing that sort of draws on what I said before, right? Because there's this popular critique. It's very poorly, I think, it shows a very poor understanding of Dialetheism, which is like, again, as I said before, if you say something, then I can just say the contrary of that, right? And then, haha, what are you going to say? But there's no sort of valid rule of inference in LP, for example, in the logic of paradox, whereby you can say this is true, and therefore the negation of that is true, right? That's not a rule of inference in LP. So that's not really that's important. Also, there is a distinction between being inconsistent and being incoherent in sort of dialetheistic terms, right? Because usually in logic both are bad and both should be avoided. But Dialetheism claims that there are some inconsistent things that can be maintained. So basically what incoherence means is trivialism. It's the same thing. It moves to trivialism, right? Like a dialetheist and a classical logician will both agree that saying that everything is true is bad, right? That's not good, right? That's basically what the common ground becomes, right? Before the common ground is there should be no contradictions, there should be all of these things. Now it's from a dialetheistic perspective, I guess it moves to, okay, we can't say that everything is true. That we really don't want that, right? Trivialism should be avoided. And so in order to avoid trivialism, we're going to move to paraconsistent logics so that we don't have to take explosion into account.
So Luke says, if we are observing potential true contradictions in things like quantum mechanics, then does that mean we need to reconsider the use of classical logic when referring to God? I think that comes back to our previous comment of we don't know enough about quantum mechanics.
I got distracted. Could you repeat? I'm very sorry, because I was reading some part of the chat, and then I was like, because I've seen that Real Life Theology is here, I'm super happy, and then so I was like reading. I don't know. Could you please repeat?
Yeah, so Luke's comment was, if we are observing potential true contradictions in things like quantum mechanics, then does that mean we need to reconsider the use of classical logic when referring to God?
So I don't know, because as I said, first of all, you can have paraconsistent systems that are not LP, that are different paraconsistent systems. But there is this temptation, I want to say, especially when it comes to philosophy of religion, right? Because there are people, there are obvious things that you can look at if you look at naively concepts like omnipotence and all of these things, right? Omniproperties of a God, right? There are some very easy things that sort of a naive understanding of these concepts will get you to that are contradictory. And of course, it could be very attractive for a theist to just go, you know what? That is sort of a dialetheia, right? That is a true contradiction, and it's fine, right? I'm just going to accept this. But as I've said at some point, I think on Twitter a while back, right? Even as a dialetheist, you'd have to concede that accepting a true contradiction is a massive theoretical cost, and it's not a theoretical cost that theism can afford. It's just not, right? Like theism is fighting, people will disagree how strong it is, but I like, my personal estimation is that it's not in a great spot in terms of sort of the the arguments that we have on the table right now and how they're evaluating the probability of it. And so if you just say, let's just throw in a true contradiction as well, then it's pretty much like in an unrecoverable position to me, right? So even if you were a dialetheist, I think you should at all costs try to avoid just being, yes, sure, let's accept true contradictions for God, because that is just not something that you can afford, in my opinion, to do.
Yeah, an example
Especially
of...
as he's supposed to be the source of all logic.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, an example, BT Toast comes up. It's one that we hear a lot of our fellow atheists say is, if God could make a rock that's too heavy to lift, he should be able to if he's able to do anything, but then that would create something he's unable to do.
Yes.
And I think the way I tend to approach that one is, I don't think that logical contradictions like that are something that should be considered when you're discussing things like God. Like, can God create a square circle? And no, he could change our minds, and he could do these sorts of things.
But as well, like, theists have already, I think, satisfactorily answered this question, right? Even without sort of accepting the true contradiction, right? You just say something like maximally powerful and something like that, which is not diminishing really God's power in my view, right? And then you would say, can God create a stone so heavy that he can lift it? No, of course he can't. But the reason why he can't is because he can do everything. And so, there's no member of that set that he could do, because that would just be impossible in a sense, right? But that's fine, right? You can accept that God can do all the things as long as they're not contradictory, and you still will have some maximally powerful, whatever, I'm still happy to call that
omnipotent,
powerful being.
Yeah, as long as it's logically possible. Yes. Yeah, as long as it's logically possible.
So as long as it's logic. Yeah.
No, I'd agree with that. I think that's the way I'd go with it. I mean, don't get me wrong. When I was first getting into these online arguments, I've definitely made it myself, and I'm so clever.
I've destroyed God.
Yeah, the other form of that is, can God kill himself?
Yeah, that's...
Yeah.
He already did, didn't he?
Something like that.
Only the human form of them.
Yeah, I know, but So you've got a comment here from Real Atheology. It says, great stream. I'd love Phil to discuss the importance of logic to the analytic philosophy of religion. Many of the best atheists, like Malpass, Oppie, and Sobel, were also master logicians as well.
Yes, I mean, I think I already sort of mentioned the implications of dialetheism in sort of like briefly in the context of philosophy of religion. But yes, like, I think it's very important. Logic was one of those discoveries, like really studying logic, that opened my eyes completely to all of this, right? Like, this is still my main passion, I think, in philosophy. I just love this stuff. And I think it teaches you a lot about how thinking works, and in general, not only in philosophy of religion, but in general, you should study logic, I think, and you will learn a lot. And of course, we know that especially in analytic philosophy of religion, there are a lot of books that are pretty hefty with this sort of stuff. So if you want to understand all of that, it would be good for you to understand sort of logic as well, or a lot of it, because then you can read the proofs and all of that. Sobel in particular is, I'm told, I haven't read it yet, but I'm told it's pretty heavy on all the proofs and all of that with logic and theism. And so, I mean, it's a good thing to understand these things, and you can see that it applies a lot in life as well. And I think it's just I don't know. It's something that I absolutely love to see, sort of these forms of reasoning captured on paper, and that you can sort of have them like statically somewhere to analyze and to improve upon and all of that. I really love that aspect of it.
Maybe it's actually something that we can come back to in a future stream and cover off some of these arguments in a bit more detail when I have a bit more of a chance to understand what's going on. But I'd be very, very interested in that.
Yeah, I really need to look more into like dialetheism and paraconsistent logic, because it's like way past what I learned as far as logic goes.
Yeah, I mean, I've also, like, the only thing that I really know about it is the things that I've looked up are the things that I've explained today. Like, I'm by no means an expert in these types of things. But like, there's a whole page on Dialetheism, Paraconsistent logic, and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as well. Like, there are things in that article, like advanced objections to Dialetheism, that I couldn't wrap my head around. So I just, like, there are very advanced things that I think in the philosophy of language and stuff, but I admit that I honestly, it's way past my current understanding, and so there are things to look at. So I just want to make sure that the people understand that this is not sort of like, oh, here's where you should be a Dialetheist, but there are things to consider on all sides. Although, again, I think it is, personally, I think Dialetheism is a respectable view to hold, especially in certain circumstances. Although you have to figure out that this is an extreme case. But for example, one of the things, you should never start an argument by saying this is a paradoxical proposition, right? Because you're already killing everything at that point. If you start your reasoning with this is a paradoxical proposition, then you're over. So, like, the application of LP, like, in general reasoning, is fine as long as you're never going to start an argument with a paradoxical proposition, and it might be something that you consider as a consequence of an argument or something like that, but not as something that you'd have to accept at the beginning, because otherwise, like, I think at the beginning, when you look at Dialetheism, you think, oh my God, this means that, everything could be contradiction and stuff. And admittedly, there have been critiques that, for example, the negation in Dialetheistic logic is not as strong as the negation in classical logic, because in classical logic, that it's the opposite. In Dialetheistic logic, a negation could be false, it could be the paradoxical, so you don't really know what was going to come out of that. So it doesn't have the same punch as like in classical logic, where you could just say, yes, right, this has to be the opposite thing. So it is a more sort of interesting or nuanced, I guess, but I don't even know.
But also more of a brain fuck.
It's also it also opens you up, because you just realize that, oh my God, right, classical logic is just a set of these sort of operators that have these tables, and this is how they're defined. But what happens if I define the operators differently? What happens if I have more than one value? And then you get into many valued logics, and you get into, like, it's all a thing, and then you discover all these wonderful things, and what would it mean? And it's like you can go down that rabbit hole like for a while. If you really want to.
Do you have any questions or anything for Philip, Dave?
Nope. I've got to rewatch the entire stream, though. Although, what would you say are some good sources to go to if you want to start looking into this? Not like actually get a good grip of it, but just start diving into it.
Yeah. So I think, as with most things philosophy, I think Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has great entries on this. Like, of course, there are going to be things in there that you're going to be like, what the hell? That's part of it. You just try to figure things out that you can get, and the other ones you can sort of get to, and they have great references as well. One absolute gem of an episode is with Malpass. Malpass had Graham Priest on in one of his podcast. That's actually how I got into contact with Dialetheism the first time, and they talk about like Dialetheism for like 2 hours and 2+ hours, and it's a great thing. They ask a lot of the like Malpass asks a lot of the questions that also Joe asked about, what would be examples in the real world, and you can hear the man himself answer these questions. And another resource that I found helpful, there is like Graham Priest has an introduction to logic sort of series on YouTube. I think there are 5-10 minutes videos or something like that. And he goes over like a bit of history of logic, and like it's a great little introduction, sort of classical logic. And he then talks briefly about sort of paraconsistent systems and Dialetheism.
It's a proper tongue twister, isn't it?
At the end of it, I'm completely, yes. So that is great. I think if you're really looking into this, because again, Graham Priest is a fairly respected logician, and he is like pushing this sort of. He's the main proponent, I would say today, of Dialetheism. I made it.
Well done.
Okay. So, yeah, I think these free resources are a great way to get started. And like, of course, if you have a foundation of logic in general beforehand, that is going to be enormously helpful. Like if you understand truth tables, if you understand validity and these sorts of things, then you will see that, dealing with just one more state that a thing can have is much, much easier for you to then sort of wrap your head around. Because if you're not solid on those things, on that part, then you're going to have a much, you're going to have a much harder time than wrapping your head around all this other stuff. Yes.
Nice one. I'll check out some of those over the weekend. Because, like I say, most of mine is just in like the typical classical logic and Aristotelian and.
Yeah. BTito says, I'm going to have to start from the beginning after this. You're not the only one. I'm going to have to go back through and watch it. So I will be going back through. I mean, it gives me a chance to put the chapters in anyway. So I'll be watching it about.
I apologize. I should have probably made it. I should have probably included more examples. The problem is that I rehearsed literally. The first time I rehearsed this was like 10 minutes before the stream started, and I was panicking completely because I was still changing graphics and stuff and animations and stuff, and I was like completely overwhelmed by this. And I was completely, and so I didn't actually sort of try to go through and listen to like how it would sound like if it makes sense. But and even I struggled at some point because I run into the same things as like I already solved in the past, like with like, what does it mean for this? Why is this operator in truth table like this? Like, that doesn't make sense. So I was like bumping my head into the same things and then remembering how like it's supposed to be. And so like I fully understand that it's a bit heavy, but like it was meant to be a bit more detailed. And I think like for someone who really wants to understand, for example, like what a valid argument is, that is already really like that really shows you like the nitty-gritty, all of the tiny things that go into what it means for an argument to be valid. And that also shows you, really it doesn't matter what you think, whether or not it's valid. And like that's just what validity is. If it has that form, it is valid, period. Like it's not a thing up to discussion. That's why nobody discusses the Kalam as an invalid argument or divine hiddenness as an invalid argument, because it has that form. And if you take the axioms of classical logic and the way operators are defined in classical logic, then there's really no discussion about it. It's valid, and that's it. You can't discuss it. That's helpful, I think.
As atheists like to say a lot, it's just logic. It's logic 101. Most of them should probably actually watch this stream and pay attention. Yeah. But I thought the presentation you did was superb. I really liked it, and it was really helpful at sort of like getting things clear in mind.
Yeah, and really classy as well.
Yeah, because thank you. Yeah, I've tried. Like, I was really unhappy at some points with that, and I've redone it many times, and that's why I wasted so much time on it, because I then changed stuff around, and then the presentation program is also not great for changing design stuff, and so it's like that. Yeah, but anyway, right? That's.
Well, if it helps, I do that with all mine as well.
Yeah,
and half the time you get through it, and it's like, huh?
Yeah, I hope it was helpful to visualize some sort of these things, because truth tables are usually much more anonymous than that, dare I say, and they're much sort of, they're like an Excel spreadsheet if you look at them. and that's not really like the most accessible thing to look at. So I thought maybe let me try to redesign this in a way that might be more sort of intuitive and helpful for people to figure out.
It was, and it made a change from just seeing P and Q everywhere.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, there's no more questions coming in at the moment. So was there anything that you wanted to add at this moment, Philip?
No, I don't think so.
Awesome. Well, I just have to say my weekly babies, no, they're not atheists. And rocks, no, they're not atheists either. And actually, I've been working on some sci-fi shorts recently. I don't know if anyone has seen them, but they're basically supposed to be about 5-minute videos, although typically the first one I released was 15 minutes long. The rest of them have been sort of 4 to 7 so far, and they're going to be released sort of one a week unless I get a chance to start recording more. And some of them are going over some of the common concepts that we discuss on these streams, but basically simplified down to a point where we're just discussing one tiny aspect of it. So if you don't have much time for these streams, and you do want to engage and you do want to learn a little bit of something, then you can just pick up one of these and go, oh, okay. Oh, and it's going to have a few references to the bigger topics where we discuss these things in more detail. And I'm also doing a mini series within that series called Bad Atheist Memes. And now, being an atheist myself, I find a lot of the memes that we atheists constantly pump out quite embarrassing. The one that's been released is Atheism is a Conclusion, and I think, if I'm right, the next one that we're going to be covering off is Babies Are Atheists. So check out the Sci-Fi Shorts playlist. Dave, sorry, do you want to say something there?
Yeah, I was just going to add one more book. If you want to start with logic, that's one of the best introductions.
That's coming through quite blurred at the moment.
Yeah, you might want to put it in.
You might have to read it out.
It's Logic, an Introduction to Elementary Logic by Wilfred Hodges. And nice. It breaks down how language is involved with logic and truth tables, and gives a good introduction to the symbols and whatnot.
Yeah, that's really great. Like, the best way to start, I think, is with some the very basics, like to understand what these sort of operators mean. Maybe you're going to start even with categorical logic, right? Because that's sort of simple.
It's simple.
Categorical logic, yes. Then you move to propositional logic, which is also sort of quite simple if you understand these truth tables at some point. And then you get to sort of predicate logic, when you have sort of like the combination of all that you've learned, right? You have both propositional logic and categorical logic sort of together with symbols, and you have all sorts of existential quantifiers and all sorts of weird stuff. And then it's going to look quite complicated if you write proofs in that. Then you have model logic up from that, and that's something that I'm not really looked much into yet. Anyway, so just a few things in there. So
I have basically a basic introduction to modal logic, but that's about it.
Yeah, so you have operators there as well, and different axioms and S4, S5s, and Ks, and all sorts of things. So it's like you can learn it. Like, you can learn a lot in logic. You can really there's a lot there, and I think it's something that everyone should at least look. Some of it you should look into it. I think it's going to help you with sort of figuring out stuff that you hear around, and whether or not they make sense sometimes. And it's going to help develop your reasoning, right? Because then you can sort of have fun trying to figure out what your conclusions, like how you would justify them, maybe write arguments and try to better your arguments, because then they're self-contained in this little thing that you can improve over time, and try to think about what premises could be easier accepted and stuff like that. And I think that is, it starts to become fascinating, where sort of having these Lego bricks, and then you're trying to sort of construct little castles and even bigger castles, and that's really, really nice.
Atheists don't want to learn it because then they would have to admit the Kalam is valid, and there goes half their arsenal.
Like that's sad, honestly. That's so sad.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, argue it's not sound, but don't complain about the validity.
Yeah. Please don't.
I think we'd all agree that it's not sound.
Yeah, I definitely think it's not sound, but please, at least the validity. Please look at the validity, please.
Awesome. Well, if that is everything for tonight, then I guess we should sign off. Thank you, everybody who has watched or is watching the rerun or is listening to the podcast version. I think the podcast version of this one might be a little bit more complex without the visual aid. This one definitely. I
didn't think about that, actually. That's something that I didn't consider the podcast thing. So that's something that you need to keep in mind for the upcoming streams as well.
That's perfectly fine. I mean, hopefully us discussing the topics is enough to give someone a basic idea, but if it might be more useful for them to actually check out the video of this one. And thank you everybody that joined in the chat. I am sorry if I missed any of your comments, and I didn't greet some of you as you came in, but we were heavily engrossed in Philip's presentation, which was absolutely fantastic. Hi, Chris has just jumped in right at the end. Yes, watch the rerun tomorrow. I'll be watching the rerun tomorrow as well when I have the chance. It was absolutely awesome, but also mind-blowing. I think it's going to take me more than an extra watch, if I'm honest. Thank you everyone else who's there. You've been watching the Fresh Air Sci-Fi Show, and I'm Joe.
And I'm Dave.
And I'm Philip. And thank you for everyone saying that it was a great presentation. I really appreciate it. You too.
And good night, all.
Good night.
Chris just said the cult. Bye.
Yeah.
Oh, I survived.